Hi everyone and welcome back. Today we're diving into one of the most grim dark places in all the far future. But we're not just looking at a place that honestly shouldn't exist. This is the very definition of grimy, as it is one of the most miserable corners of the entire 40k map. We're talking about Barbarus, located all the way out in Segmentum Tempestus. This wasn't just some backwater rock. It was a feral world, a death world, and eventually the cradle for one of the most terrifying, disgusting legions ever to walk the stars, the Death Guard. But before the power armor and galactic civil wars left the planet in a worse state than when it began as, despite how hard that is to imagine, the whole planet was a mire, wrapped in this thick, virulent, poisonous gas, a constant choking fog that never lifted. It was a place of permanent twilight, where the daytime was just slightly lighter in gray tones than midnight. If you were a human living here, you were stuck in the lowest of the valleys and the plainest of the plains, because that was the only place where the air wouldn't melt your lungs the moment you entered. But here's the worst part. Even though this air was better down here, you weren't alone. At night, things would come out of the fog. Predators that don't just want to eat you, they want to drag you into the dark. It is the embodiment of pure atmospheric horror, given flesh, if flesh was rock and stone. And it only gets worse when you look up the mountain. You see, the higher ground on Barbarus belonged to the Overlords. These were a cruel, mysterious Xenos species that actually thrived in this toxic miasma soup upon the upper atmosphere. They built these massive, terrifying, gray keeps all the way up in the peaks where no human could ever hope to survive. From these mountain fortresses, they looked down upon humanity, like we were nothing but cattle and experimental playthings. They descended to the valleys to snatch up some slaves and spread a level of terror that's hard to even wrap your head around. It stayed this way for a very long time. Humanity huddled in the dirt, praying, begging that the fog wouldn't scream. That is, until a certain pod crashed onto the mountainside. That pod carried Mortarion, one of the Emperor's divine creations, the Primarchs. Now Mortarion is a rather fascinating Primarch, a tragic figure because rather than being raised by humanity, he was fathered by one of these vile Xenos Overlords. But he eventually realized just how monstrous his father truly was. He then decided to do the unthinkable. He went down to the humans, taught them how to fight, and led a massive peasant revolt, all to topple the mountain dwellers. He basically turned a world of victims into a land of survivors. Before the planet was eventually lost, they even built something called the Wall of Memory, where the name of every single Death Guard Marine who died during the Great Crusade nobly was carved into stone. This was a planet defined by endurance and sheer resilience, regardless of how disgusting their methods would eventually become. But this is where their history, in particular that of the world of Barbarus, gets, well, a little weird. In the records of the Imperium's lore, particular excerpts are often left redacted, and Barbarus is a prime example of that. We know the planet was destroyed, at least we believe so, and it was officially listed as class destroyed. However, while it is suspected that it might have been Lionel Johnson who did the deed, or even the Inquisition, we don't actually know the how or the when, or even if remains of this planet still exist. Realistically, it depends on which imperial scribe you ask, and which codices you read. Some sources say it was wiped out just after the Horus Heresy, in the midst of the Great Scouring, ironically enough, where the Imperium supposedly used virus bombs to erase every traitor homeworld that remained from the map. However, other accounts claim that the Dark Angels got there first, right before the Siege of Terra, and cracked the planet wide open with cyclonic torpedoes. There's even talk about a massive land invasion before the end of the heresy itself. However, regardless of the method, Barbarus is gone, a ghost of a world that left a toxic mark on the galaxy forever. With that overview done, we can move into deeper aspects of the lore of Barbarus, and we'll run into a major problem right off the bat. We shouldn't actually know any of this. It's one of those classic redacted by the Imperium situations. However, this one's on a galactic scale. After the Emperor found Mortarion, a lot of the planet's history was, let's say, sanitized, even before the heresy. The official Imperial records are suspiciously thin for some reason, almost like the Emperor himself wanted to scrub the memory of the Xenos race who ruled the world out from the collective memories of humanity. The only reason we have a coherent story at all is thanks to a guy named Lackland Thorn. He was a remembrancer, which is basically a high-stakes historian for the Great Crusade, attached with the expeditionary fleet that first cracked the dark nebula surrounding this planet. He wrote something called the Stygian Scrolls, and while he's often called a disreputable writer, his notes are the only real window the Imperium has into the absolute nightmare that was Mortarion's childhood. Now let's look at the geography of this vile, disgusting place, because it's actually somewhat terrifying. We're in the Segmentum Tempestus, orbiting a dim, sickly yellow sun that barely gives off enough light for the solar system. And this planet's atmosphere wasn't just bad air. It was a miasmic, toxic soup of chemicals. And the weird part was, the most virulent and deadly gases, rather than settling like they normally would on this world, actually rose towards the sun because of the heat. This created a literal ceiling of poison, where if you were a human living there, your entire existence was squeezed into the lowest possible elevations. Flat moors, jagged valleys, and deep basins. You lived in a world of permanent twilight, where the daylight was just slightly less oppressive shades of gray. You couldn't see the stars, you couldn't see the sun, and if you climbed too high, your lungs would just become soup. It was the ultimate manifestation of an open world, claustrophobic horror. But even the environment wasn't the worst part. That title goes to the Overlords. When humans first crash landed on Barbarus during the Age of Strife, they were basically set all the way back to a pre-feudal medieval state. They were living in mud huts and terrified of the dark. And up in the mountains, you had these alien beings that were essentially living gods of cruelty. These overlords weren't just your standard run-of-the-mill Xenos that you can find in any sci-fi novel. They had massive, incomprehensible, warp-based powers, which let them breathe the poison air and live in and, along with carve, these massive stone keeps. Said power allowed them to treat humanity like a biological toy box. They would descend into the valleys, not just to kill, but to experiment, to mutate, and to prey on the population, even performing necromantic rituals. To the humans of Barbarus, these weren't invaders. These weren't people attacking them. They were supernatural spectral beings, demons if you will. And that leads us to the final grim end to Barbarus' story. You might wonder, why didn't the Imperium just fix the planet after the Great Crusade? Well, the answer is, you can't fix a place that's been marinating in that much chaos corruption for thousands upon thousands of years. Just before the end of the Horus Heresy, the Dark Angels, supposedly acting as the Emperor's exterminators, showed up. And they didn't just come to liberate, they came to delete, revenge, vindication, if you will. They used, or at least were told they might have used, cyclonic torpedoes, which are basically the Imperium's delete keys for a planet's crust. They spotted the level of warp taint on the surface of the world and decided that the only way to save the galaxy from Barbarus's disgusting resilience was to make sure Barbarus didn't exist anymore, and so would come the tragic heavy end for the world. However, long before that, and leading to its final destination, was Mortarion. And he is just a giant moth of nasty, gross biles, pox, and oozes. In the beginning, he was one of the Emperor's sons. You have to imagine it. The Emperor has basically these 20 super babies, his Primarch, and the Chaos Gods, essentially manifestations of every bad vibe in the universe, decide to scatter them with the aid of their mother, whose bright idea of saving her children was to shoot them at random into literal space hell without a plan. And while most of them land on worlds that are tough, sure, but relatively habitable, Mortarion, he gets one of the shorter ends of the sticks. According to the Stygian Scrolls, he didn't just land on the planet, he landed on a bleak moor, covered in a league of corpses that were being played with by necromancers. This was Barbarus, a place where the air itself was trying to kill him from the very moment he landed. And these mountains were ruled not just by the regular Xenos, but by their own warlords, whose horrific appetites were known far and wide. And while just below the fog the humans were existing, living as veritable cattle, we reach the encounter that changes everything. The greatest of these mountain overlords is out walking as a scuttling abomination. making his way across a fresh battlefield, probably feeling pretty good about himself, when he hears a child's cry. Now, normally a human baby would have melted or suffocated instantly at this high an altitude, but little Mortarion was just chilling there, blasting out cries at the top of his lungs. The Overlord, fascinated by this, sees the infant and thinks, finally a son and an heir who won't die the second I take him home. I can finally get mother off my back, about settling down and giving her grandchildren. He proceeds to name the precocious baby Mortarion, which morbidly enough translates literally to child of death. Not the most heartwarming name, but considering he was born on a field of corpses and that the 40k galaxy doesn't seem to be very good at creatively naming things, it's pretty on brand. Now, growing up as the adopted son of a monster would go about exactly how you'd expect. The Overlord basically ran science experiments on Mortarion to see exactly how much poison his little lungs could handle. Once he found the limit, he built Mortarion a stony keep right at the very edge and fenced it in with black iron. From there, Mortarion watched as his father would go to war against the other lords. And this wasn't just normal war, we're talking about armies of golems made of flesh and mire stitched together from the dead and the dying. Tormented shapeshifters whose baleful cries were only half as horrifying as their appearances, which would cause the heart of a regular man to shatter at the bare sight of it. It was a constant cycle of necromancy and nightmare fuel. But Mortarion wasn't just surviving, he was a Primarch. He was superhumanly strong and insanely, disgustingly resilient. More importantly, he was smart enough to start asking questions. The big question in particular was, who are these tiny fragile things in the valleys? The Overlord tried to hide the humans, treating them like a forbidden secret. But that only made Mortarion more obsessed about finding out who and what they were. He saw them as victims of the very father who was raising him. Eventually, tension reached its boiling point, and Mortarion snapped. He decided that he'd had enough of his keeps and the stitched armies of the dead and damned, proceeding to slip through the dungeons, starting his long trek down the mountain. The last thing he heard was the Overlord's booming voice through the toxic clouds basically saying, "If you leave, don't you dare come back, because next time we meet, it's for real, son." So Mortarion finally makes his trip all the way down the mountain, and it's basically sensory overload. For the first time in his life, he's breathing air that doesn't feel like liquid fire. He smells actual food, hears people laughing, sees crops that aren't mutated by warp-based poisons. It's this massive light bulb moment that he realizes that the fragile prey his adopted father talked about, those are actually his people. And he's one of them, not just in a social sense, but in a more intrinsically biological aspect. And naturally, that realization comes with a side of absolute Primarch tier rage. He takes a look at these people, his people, living in squalor and terror. Then he decides, right then and there, that these gods on the mountain are going to have to pay a very steep bill for what they've done. But here's the problem. If you're a peasant on Barbarus and then a 10-foot tall, gaunt, deathly pale giant with hollow yellow eyes comes walking out of the forbidden poison mist, you aren't going to be thinking, "Oh, look, a savior has come to take us out of this hell." But rather you're thinking, okay, which mountain lord sent this absolute abomination to eat us? Mortarion, despite him attempting to be civil, was a sight to behold, terrifying in every way, shape, and form. He carried the physical weight of the horrors he'd seen, and the villagers treated him with pure suspicion. But being a Primarch, he had the inbuilt patience of a saint, or a very determined reaper, to say the least, as one would need to have as a general of massive world-dominating armies. It must be noted that, to his credit, he did not force them to love him. He just started working. He used his demigod strength to harvest their meager crops, biding his time until the monsters inevitably showed to collect their taxes. And show up they did. A lesser lord descended with an army of corpse thralls, basically stitched together zombies to terrorize the village. The humans tried to fight back the best they could, but they had pitchforks, torches, stuff you'd see at a mob trying to take down one singular Frankenstein and fail, and they were getting understandably steamrolled. That's when Mortarion finally stepped out, and he grabbed a massive two-handed harvesting scythe, which, let's be real, is functionally useless, but it's a very cool aesthetic choice. And he didn't just fight, he annihilated, obliterated, decimated all the foes that stood before him. The Xenos Lord actually had the audacity to smile seeing this, thinking he could just fly back up into the poisoned mire where no human could follow and be alright. Unfortunately for him, he was still wearing that smug look when Mortarion caught up to him halfway up the mountain and introduced him to the business end of a farming implement. After that, the "is he just a monster" debate was pretty much over. Mortarion was the big boss, and from that point on, Mortarion stops just being a savior and starts being a general proper. He spends his day traveling from village to village, teaching the peasants how to actually fight back instead of just cowering. He turns blacksmiths into weapons manufacturers of the modern age, and farmers into soldiers. But he's smart, and he realizes that as long as the overlords can hide in the poison clouds, the humans will always be on the defensive. So he gathers the toughest and most resilient humans he can find, the ancestors of what will eventually become the Death Guard, and he starts using his massive intellect to solve the poison air problem, essentially inventing the galaxy's first high-tech gas mask and environmentally sealed suit, just so he can start to take the fight to his father's front door. It's the ultimate underdog story if an underdog happened to be a 10-foot tall walking engine of bioengineered destruction created with the partial fragments of lesser warp deities, all to serve in a massive war that would put an end to the four primary forces of chaos, the false gibbering gods. So this is where the story shifts from Barbarus being a world perfect for a survival horror movie into a full-blown French Revolution, and honestly, you could see it as one of the coolest hustle stories in the entire galaxy. Usually when the overlords would come down to the valleys, it's a one-way street of misery, but one day, an overlord descends, expecting the usual easy slaughter. Instead, he hits a brick wall. Mortarion just doesn't drive him back. He does the unthinkable. He follows them, and being one of those Xenos warlords retreating into your impenetrable poison cloud, thinking you're safe because no human can breathe up here, only to hear the heavy rhythmic thumping of massive size 22 boots coming through the mist. And the worst part is terrifying. And the worst part is, it wasn't just that one giant stomp, it was a bunch of smaller ones, as Mortarion had outfitted his best warriors with these incredibly crude DIY breathing apparatuses, very similar to what he would eventually wear later on during the Great Crusade. They were just these very rudimentary filtering masks with hoses that had this very diesel punk or World War I style appeal to them. And he led his retinue, which he had officially dubbed the Death Guard, right into the very heart of the poison. And they didn't just win, they absolutely dismantled the warlord's army on his very own turf. And this started a campaign that would last for months, as Mortarion was constantly tweaking their gear, making it more effective with better filters, taking all he could from the overlords and integrating that into the technology of his rebel army. But there was a side effect nobody expected. The constant exposure to these horrific gases was actually changing the Death Guard, as they weren't just surviving, they were becoming biologically hardened. They were developing this legendary, disgustingly resilient body that would define them for the next 10,000 years. Essentially, they would become guys who could walk through literal bioweapon strikes and keep coming. Meaning that as they fought their way up the poisonous spire that would lead to Mortarion's dad, they could continuously clear out one fortress after another, setting up keeps and using their enemies' own fortifications against them, even as the atmosphere kept getting nastier and nastier. We're talking about a chemical soup so thick that if even the most minor amount of facial hair disallowed the perfect seal from being made with the gas mask, that death would be immediate, as their lungs wouldn't just become soup, they would somehow become less than soup. Eventually, only one fortress would remain, the high-altitude mesa where the overlord who had raised Mortarion sat. This was the literal final boss of the world. But the tragic part is, the air at the very top of the mountain was so concentrated with that deathly miasma that even Mortarion a literal demigod started to choke and wheeze. He realized that his current gear left his men in a position that they wouldn't survive the final push. So he was forced to pull back, just feet away from his ultimate goal. And he goes back down the valleys to regroup, probably feeling frustrated, exhausted, and humiliated, thinking he just needs a little more time to perfect his technology. But then, suddenly, the sky changes. And you have to understand, these people have never seen the sun. Just a dim yellow smudge, somewhat radiating through the miasma of clouds. Then suddenly something much brighter than the sun descends through the atmosphere. And this was the titular Emperor of Mankind who had just arrived. And as he often does, he's about to turn Mortarion's entire world upside down, just as the finish line was in sight for old Morty. And so Mortarion finally manages to drag himself back down to the main village, exhausted and probably a little frustrated that he couldn't actually reach that final peak, never quite getting to the climax of his story, falling a little short at the end. But when he gets there, the vibe around is just weird. The village isn't just not dying anymore, it's actually alive. There's music, there's food, and everyone's gossiping about this mysterious great benefactor who just showed up out of nowhere and is promising salvation. Now, if you're Mortarion and you've spent your entire life bleeding and choking on poison to save these people, seeing some new guy just walk about and take the credit, that's gonna sting. And suddenly, Mortarion's mood goes from tired hero to absolutely livid man-child real quick as he storms the main hall. And that's when he sees him. The stranger sitting there at the table is literally the opposite of everything on Barbarus. While local people are gaunt, pale, sickly from the fog, and generally emaciated, this man is bronze and physically perfect. He's glowing even, and not that glow that women have when they're with child. More of a, like Hercules in the Disney movie. Then the connection is obvious. They look like father and son. Well, kinda. But Mortarion is too blinded by spite and pride to see that this benefactor is something or someone who should be treated with anything but pure hostility. He basically walked down his dad and said, "Listen buddy, I don't know who you are, but my Death Guard and I have this handled. We don't need your help." But the stranger doesn't get angry. He just sits there, completely unbothered, almost like Mortarion was just a fly buzzing around his face, which somehow makes Mortarion even angrier. Then the stranger drops a gauntlet. He calmly points out that Mortarion actually didn't finish his job and that he failed to reach the last citadel. So he offers Morty a bet. If Mortarion can go up alone and kill the High Overlord, the stranger will pack up and leave Barbarus forever. But if Mortarion fails, then he has to swear fealty to the stranger and join his Imperium of Man. Despite his men begging him not to do it, Mortarion's bottomless depths of pride win out, and he turns on his heel, then starts to climb. He's driven by justice, sure, but mostly this is out of a desperate, burning need to prove this golden god that he doesn't need a father. But the mountain doesn't care about pride, as Mortarion climbs higher and higher still than he ever has before. The air becomes a literal soup, which he could ladle with a spoon, of acidic death. His breathing gear, his most advanced one ever, the stuff he spent many long years perfecting, starts to actually rot, melt, and decay in a manner which honestly mirrors many of Nurgle's followers' abilities. And his face starts to twinge as he staggers to the very gates of the Overlord's citadel, coughing up blood, defiant to the very end. However, the last thing he sees before the world goes grey is his old father, the Xenos Overlord, stepping out of his keep to finally kill him. But just as the final blow was about to land, the stranger appears out of the mist, completely unaffected and untainted by the poison, and he deletes the Overlord from existence with a single swing of his flaming power sword. Just like that, the war for Barbarus was over, but Mortarion's long and complicated relationship with the Emperor had only just begun. So the dust finally settled on Barbarus, and Mortarion, being a man of his word, reluctantly bends the knee. He lost a bet, and now he owes this glowing stranger his life. And it's at this moment where the stranger reveals he's not just a benefactor, but he is, in fact, his papa. And that he had a whole legion of super soldiers who are genetically based on Mortarion, just waiting to be led by him. This was the 14th Legion, and before Mortarion took over, they were known as the Dusk Raiders, who had this terrifying reputation where they would attack just at sunset, wearing storm grey armor with a crimson arm. The idea was to show the galaxy that they were the Emperor's red right hand. They were so effective that enemies literally surrendered the moment the sun went down, just to avoid fighting them. But Mortarion wasn't interested in anyone else's right hand. He renamed the entire Legion as his Death Guard after his own rebel army, and he told his sons, "You are now my unbroken blades," along with filling their ranks with the hardy survivors of Barbarus, cementing the never say die attitude into their very genes. But with what is thematic in Warhammer, things rarely stay heroic or nice for very long. Fast forward to the Great Crusade and the chaos of the Horus Heresy, we end up seeing the tragic fate of Barbarus itself. Remember how we talked about the Dark Angels before, and how it's likely the most probable story of what actually happened? Well, they showed up unannounced just before the Siege of Terra happened, as Lionel Johnson was hunting down traitor planets and erasing them from existence as revenge for continuously supplying the traitor legions with resources, capital, and manpower. Also as a metaphorical middle finger to his traitorous kin. And the Dark Angels showed up, blasted the planet with cyclonic torpedoes to the point that it no longer exists. However, killing it was basically a mercy, as it had become not just a bastion of traitorous corruption, but a bastion of demonic blight. And where Mortarion, now a butterfly of death, a moth of maladies, the stinky flapping child of Nurgle, heard that his childhood home was gone, naught but ash, he barely flinched. He was so far gone at this point into his own bitterness and the influence of chaos that a dead world didn't seem to matter. However, deep down it did, though his Marines certainly would hold a grudge, dreaming of doing the same to the Dark Angels' homeworld, ironically enough. Ironically enough, that also got blasted into oblivion by the Dark Angels. This leads us into another twisted irony in Mortarion's life. After he, along with the traitors, fled into the Eye of Terror, Mortarion was given a gift by his new patron, the Plague God Nurgle. He was granted a world of his own, the Plague Planet. And what did Mortarion do with all that infinite demonic power, time, and a whole planet? He made a 1-to-1 scale replica of Barbarus. He built a world of poison, misery, rotting fog, and he sits at the highest peak, just like his old papa, the place he hated with a passion, ruling over festering villages where humans cower in terror from diseased things that roam the mist. He literally became the overlord of his very own world, the new monster ruling in a mountain. So that's the tragedy of Barbarus. It's a story that starts with a monster on a mountain and ends with a different monster on a different mountain, but just more pus, bile, and flies, along with bodily seepage. Mortarion spent his entire youth hating the gods, who breathed poison and looked down upon the weak, only to become the ultimate version of this very nightmare. He traded one cruel father for another. First the Overlord, then the Emperor, and finally his grandfather Nurgle, all while convinced he was the only one who was truly free. At least Angron was unable to recognize that he was chained by the hands of another, due to his brain being functionally mush. It makes you wonder if the Child of Death ever actually left those jagged peaks, or if he just brought the fog down with him wherever he went. The planet Barbarus itself is currently just a cloud of space dust and debris, thanks to the Dark Angels or the Inquisition. I'd put my bet on the Sons of the Lions having done it. However, its legacy lives on in every cough, in every rusted blade, and in every relentless step of the Death Guard. They're still the unbroken blades, they're still the kings of the trenches, and they're still walking through the kind of hell that they were back when the Overlords ruled Barbarus. But at the end of the day, Mortarion got exactly what he wanted, to be able to sit on the throne of a world where he never has to worry about the sun coming out, and there's never an Overlord ruling over his little people. Well, thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this deep dive into the most toxic real estate in the Segmentum Tempestus, make sure you do all that stuff that YouTube really wants you to do. Both commenting and liking, since they really do help me in the algorithm, and subscribing so you don't miss out on any of the videos I make. Thank you and have a nice day.